All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here. We've got an exciting and an important conversation to have. I'm thrilled to be up here with such an accomplished panel. Looking forward to what you guys have to say on this topic. Let me get right to it, introduce you to the panel. You've got the longer bios in your packets and online, so I won't go into all the detail of what all of these folks have accomplished, but we've got Derrell Bradford here. Derrell is president of 50CAN. 50CAN is one of the largest, and I would say most effective, education advocacy organizations in the country. We've got Christopher Cleveland, who is a guy who wears a number of different hats, manager at Education Resource Strategies, and also a PhD candidate finishing up his dissertation at Harvard focused on education. And we've got Kelley Williams-Bolar. Kelley is a teacher, a mother, and an activist, someone who has close and personal experience with how difficult it can be these days to find the right education for your kids. And we'll hear, Kelley, your story in a few minutes. My name's Brian Hooks. I'm the CEO of Stand Together. Stand Together is a philanthropic community. We work with hundreds of philanthropists, business leaders who unite to try to find new and better ways to remove the barriers that are preventing people from realizing their potential. We operate across a number of different issues, but if that's our vision, you've got to believe that we have a major focus in education. And indeed we do. We support well over 1,000 educational entrepreneurs, people who come from all sorts of different backgrounds, have different approaches to education, but share a vision that the purpose for education is helping every student to realize their gifts, discover what they're good at, what they're passionate about, find ways to develop those gifts into valued skills, and then see opportunities to apply those skills in a way that benefits themselves by benefiting others. And these education entrepreneurs share our vision that the future of education will be individualized, and that's a future that can help better serve all students. And so I'm sitting here now in a room with people who are passionate about education, know a whole lot about education, so I don't need to tell you all about the gap between what could be and what is, whereas we like to think about the opportunity to make a great difference and do a whole lot better in education, but that's what we're here to talk about. When I think about the challenges in education, I think about how education is not working as well as it could be for everyone involved. And so when you think about students, by the 12th grade, when 65% of kids report being completely disengaged from their studies, it's very difficult to discover your gifts and develop them if you're completely disengaged. When you think about parents, in a country where we focus so much on what divides us, one thing unites parents. About 80% of parents say that our current school system is in crisis. 2/3 say that we need to radically rethink the way that we educate our kids. And when you think about teachers, the current system's not working nearly as well as it could for teachers. I don't need to tell you guys that. A lot of people here, I'm sure, interact with teachers every day. I think about the current crisis, the shortage of teachers right now, as a huge warning flag. It's of course the result of COVID, it's been highlighted because of COVID, but it's the result of some pretty fundamental challenges in the system. And to make matters worse, those problems are not equal opportunity offenders. Right? Certain communities bear the disproportionate burden of those challenges, communities of color, and specifically Black Americans. So the stat that really stands out in my mind here is that 6 in 10 Black students go to schools that are classified as poor or under-resourced. And you contrast that with 1 in 10 white kids. And I'm sure you've all seen the research as I have in the last couple of years that our school system today is at least as segregated by race, if not more segregated, than it was in 1968. And so I don't want to pretend that there's any single solution to any of those problems. There's lots and lots of things that need to happen in order for us to make the progress that we need to make. But as we'll talk about today, there is one thing that, unless addressed, will make it much harder to address any of those problems. And that's the fact that for tens of millions of kids in our country today, it's not their gifts, it's not their interests, it's not their needs, it's not their aptitudes that determine where they go to school. It's where their parents live. So residential assignment or zip code assignment, which we'll talk about today, is something that's kind of baked into our system. We very, very well take it for granted. But as we'll talk about today, this is the consequence of intentional policy decisions that were made throughout the past 100 years, often during very ugly times in our country's history, and have profound consequences for the kids today and ultimately for the future of our country. And so with that as the framing for our discussion, we're going to turn to the panel for some ideas about what can be done. But before we get there, Derrell, I want to turn to you first. Just kind of set the table for us. Make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. What is residential assignment, zip code assignment, and why should we care?
Yeah, so again, thanks again for having me, and thank you for your partnership, Brian. I grew up in Southwest Baltimore, which is a neighborhood that people know, not because I grew up there, but because a few years ago, yeah, like me growing up there is not auspicious. But because a few years ago, a young man named Freddie Gray died at the hands of the police there, and my neighborhood was on fire on the 6 o'clock news. And I've written about this. It was like very frustrating. I don't recommend it. If seeing your neighborhood on fire on national television is not something I recommend. But I grew up there, and I remembered it well. And one of the earliest conversations I can remember is my mother and my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table, having a discussion about whose address we were going to use, so I could go to the middle school I was not zoned for. So that middle school it's called Mount Royal. It's in the Bolton Hill section of Baltimore. If you guys know Baltimore, is where the Maryland Institute is. It's over there, sort of like a nice little burg in downtown Baltimore. And the school I was zoned for was called Harlem Park, which if you know your TFA lore, was actually the place where Michelle Rhee taught first. I never had to actually make that decision because I had an aunt who taught in the Baltimore City public school system, and she really looked out for me, and she made sure that I got into another school I was not zoned for, which was like a gifted and talented school over on the other side of town that I was bused to, and then I went to like this middle school that was in this area of Baltimore. For anybody who knows Baltimore, if you're a Baltimorean, please raise your hand. If you've been through Baltimore, you can raise your hand. But it was in the Roland Park section of Baltimore, which is like one of the nicest. The same guy who designed Central Park designed this part of Baltimore. And it was actually sort of like the worst school for me, but I went there on sort of like an out of bounds program. And then I finished my schooling in like an independent day school where I got a scholarship. And it wasn't until like 20 years later, I can't even remember how many years later it was, when I started working on education policy, that I realized that the conversation that my mother and grandmother were having was both deeply subversive and illegal. Like the thing that they were discussing me doing to get the education that was going to make me the best version of myself was they were going to break the law for me to do it. That was a common thing, right? Like, we're just a black family growing up in Southwest Baltimore. Like, everybody knows somebody who is trying to get a utility bill or like trying to know somebody. I know nobody in here has ever done this, because this is a room full of law-abiding citizens, right? But if you know somebody who has lied about their address to get into a school that they weren't zoned for, raise your hand, right? I mean, it's just, this is a thing. So when we talk about like residential assignment, right? We're talking about the process that means that the place that you live is the most important factor in where you go to school. And I remember doing this thing for Axios earlier in the year, and somebody was like, well, why is this so corrosive? Why is this so subversive to link these two things together? And I was like, well, we have this system of place in America. And place is really important because we have a system of place that's based upon a system of race, right? Which Chris can tell you about exhaustively. But the history of that exchange at that kitchen table in Baltimore, which ultimately shaped my life, significantly, and I sort of like come out on the good end of it, I hope, is one that is the byproduct of 100 years of like legitimately race-based racist policy. Like, I don't say that all the time, but when you read the literature and it says no Negroes, right? Or like no this person or no that person, and then you see how that's played out to give us some of the statistics that Brian talked about earlier, and school finance mechanisms and sort of school zoning that live right on top of like explicitly racist policies. That to me just doesn't meet our ideals, right? As a nation of people who are looking to have the next generation of folks become the best version of themselves. So go ahead, Brian.
Well, so I think we definitely want to get into the history of these policies for sure, but the fact that so many students, the majority of students in our country, are now sorted by where their parents live. This is a fact of the system, as you experienced firsthand, but not everybody has. So you could be forgiven, even if you are very interested in education policy, of not understanding what's at stake here. I want to just ask Kelley if you can share, you experienced firsthand how serious the society takes this sort of sorting of kids based on geography. Your story is very compelling. Share it with us if you would.
Absolutely, and thank you for allowing me to come and to talk and to tell my story. I live in Akron, Ohio, and I was married and I got a divorce, and I was going to college and working, going to different, subbing as a paraprofessional. And I remember my father would tell me, he would say, you know what, because he lived in a really nice, top-notch district. And he would always say, Kelley, bring your kids out here. You know, I'm here, I'm home. And one year I said, okay, I'm gonna do it. It would help me because he's helping me, you know. And that's what my parents did. They would help me if I ever needed it. And I don't know why I feel emotional already, but I try not to get emotional because, you know, I have to tell the story, so, all right. So I enrolled my kids at the district. They were there for the first year. Everything was fine. They were excelling. They were doing fine. The second year, they hired a private eye. He followed me around for, I think it was 14 days. That's what it said in court, 14 days. They realized I didn't live in the district, just my parents did. So we tried to get something called the grandparent power of attorney, which they do accept that. I guess it was a little too late, they didn't want it. So that June, the judge at the juvenile court sent me a letter just saying, you know what, just remove the students and, you know, and everything will be fine. I did just what she said. My kids were back in Akron Public Schools. 18 months later, I received an indictment, and I didn't know what an indictment was because I had never been in trouble before. And it was just, actually it was a postcard, and it just said Kelley Williams-Bolar versus the state of Ohio, so still I didn't know. And I was trying to figure it out, and I called my dad, because you know he's older and he knows more. He was like, come out here. So we're sitting there. He said, go check my mailbox. And he had one too. And so I'm like, okay, so what is this? And he never said anything. He just said, we're just gonna do this. We'll go to court, find out. Went to court, that's what it was. It was Copley Fairlawn City Schools versus myself and my father. That's the process. So we had to go to court. We had to, you know, I had to go to court. I had to go before a jury. I got sentenced. They charged me with 3 felonies, but they dropped one, and I ended up getting grand theft and tampering with documents because I didn't live in the district, and they said that I stole $35,000 worth of their education for both students. So that means I was $70,000 of grand theft. I went to jail. My dad, I had 10 days, and I was on probation for 3 years, and if I had done anything, I would have done 5 + 5. I would be just now getting out this year. My dad, they charged him as well, but they had to drop his charges because he didn't enroll the kids. My father was sick. He just told me to use his address. And what happened was they had to drop his charges. When they dropped his charges, they had to find something else because they're just not going to let you go home. So they started looking for Social Security. My father was sick. He had many illnesses. And they started, they was like, well, you stole $100,000 worth of medical because he was sick. He had strokes. He had all these different things. They said, you should have gotten SSI versus that. So they ended up sending him to the penitentiary for an entire year. All of this was behind education. My dad died in jail. He never came home, and he was a very good father, and all he wanted was his kids and his grandchildren, you know, to have a safe environment and have a good education. That was it. So that's why I'm here. sure I'm missing something, but it just gets to me, and I get so emotional because I don't feel no one should ever go through what my family went through, and I'm fighting, and I'm gonna fight until I don't breathe anymore, that this has to cease. No parent, no guardian, no grandparent should ever have to be penalized for public education and to die in jail and to suffer like we did. That should never happen again.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, thank you.
So thank you for sharing your story. I know you've had to do that a number of times, but it's so important that people see the human cost of the kind of policies that we're talking about. I mean, $70,000.
Yeah.
Your father lives in this district, he pays the taxes there. And then to put your family through that, and all you were trying to do was to do what a mother does and find the best education for their kids. Chris, what is going on here? Help us understand the origins of the laws that do these sorts of things to families like Kelley's.
Yeah, well, Kelley, thank you for sharing your story. That's deeply emotional. So hard to follow up on that, honestly, but I'll do my best. So there's both a housing and schooling aspect of America's past that we have to contend with in this discussion. And so when we look at the early 1900s through like 1970, there's a broad housing pattern in which we see a large number of African Americans moving out of the South, like trying to flee from like racial violence in the South and pursuing new opportunities in the North, what's often considered to be like the Great Migration. And that is a sort of migratory pattern that's also compounded by various other influxes of immigrants from European countries and other parts of the world. And so during the early 1900s, we see a vastly like changing America in terms of where people live and the opportunities that they're seeking in terms of like job opportunities. What is apparent when we look at the literature and sort of like ongoing debates about how these migratory patterns changed America. We see during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, a lot of documentation around the role in which various federal agencies played in shaping or like reinforcing the housing patterns that exist because of social networks. Like I'm moving from Georgia to Chicago. I have friends and family that I know in a particular neighborhood in Chicago. I choose to go live with them. Once I'm living in Chicago, I say, I think I actually want to like live somewhere else. There seems to be better opportunity in another part of the city for my family. But what we know is that through various like federal agencies, it's like much harder for Black Americans, other people of color, to actually get mortgage loans to move to other neighborhoods, and so it sort of compounds the way in which we see different racial makeups in neighborhoods across the country, and something that persists through the majority of the 1900s, resulting in various like housing acts being put in place once we had a more progressive orientation in the federal government and in local state legislations. I think it's like very insightful to go look at the way in which people of color are talked about in some of these early federal documents. I always turn back to this portrayal of a neighborhood in Los Angeles that was considered to be a D-graded neighborhood by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And it said it's a D neighborhood because of the insidious prevalence of Japanese and Negroes, and a healthy number of Jews. Like, this is like federal documentation, things that still exist. There are a large number of these documents that have been destroyed to sort of erase this way in which the government has not necessarily supported the pursuit of the American dream throughout history. And so what is sort of layered on with this housing issue is the way in which schools are facilitated and managed in this country. Through the early 1900s, a large proportion of dollars to support schools across this country were raised through local property taxes. And so if we presume that the values of areas that had more black people are lower and the values of the properties where there are more white people are higher, we can imagine that leads to very disparate outcomes in terms of what schools are able to do to service students. And what we have seen be the progression of funding over the course of the mid-1900s to early 2000s is that we see more of the sort of Title I IDA funds, like federal government funds, trying to sort of be more progressive to make up for differences in local funding. We also see some states taking the initiative to introduce like equity-based funding formulas. But what is still the case when we look at patterns in funding and racial demographics as recent as like 2018, pre-pandemic, we do see a continued sort of codification of segregation across schools where schools in neighborhoods that were considered degraded neighborhoods in the 1930s are still majority black. They are also lower funded when it comes to local funding, and they're also lower achieving. And so we have to really consider what it means to actually move beyond the policies of the 1930s that continue to lead us to the outcomes that we see today.
So Chris, fair to say for a large part of the 1900s, there are explicitly racist policies that discriminate against communities of color, specifically black Americans, make it very difficult, often impossible, to get things like mortgages, to be able to buy homes in neighborhoods that accumulate wealth. And we see these things persist, as you say, without any attempt to hide it. Then we put school zoning lines on top of neighborhoods where you've got a concentration of people who have been discriminated against and those who have had the benefit of the lack of discrimination. And that's the way that our school system continues to be organized. And the consequences of that are that we've got parents that are forced with the choice between sending their kids to schools that are not well suited or going to jail. So this is a huge issue. I want to move from an acknowledgement of the challenges, and we've only begun to scratch the surface, but I want to get to what can we do about this. And you all are on the front lines of trying to make improvements here from a practical perspective, and I'd invite anyone to chime in on this. What can be done? How can we start to make progress and move beyond the system that's so entrenched in the history that you just described? Derrell, maybe you can kick us off.
Sure. I mean, the first, this is going to sound sort of counterintuitive, but the first thing we can do is sort of acknowledge that we have a problem, right? And it's interesting for me on this, like as long as this has been framed as like a zero-sum problem, right, where there are people who are in the places you want to be and the schools that are zoned to those areas belong to them, right? The people who are not in those zones have been unable to win the political battle to change that to this point in our history, right? So the first thing is like, I want to acknowledge it, and I also want to acknowledge the fact that like basically nobody today created this system, right? It's pernicious, it has a lot of momentum, it distorts the behavior of lots of different people, and we're all sort of caught up in it. So let's be honest about that, right? And if we can agree on that, then we can decide on some solutions. That's my first thing. The second thing, which I think Chris can probably speak to more elegantly than I can, is that you have to change how we finance schools so it decouples you thinking that your tax dollars get you your school that is next to your house, right? And there are ways you can do that. You can have larger taxing jurisdictions, right? Instead of having like a very small school district, which is like common in the Northeast, and for instance, like New Jersey has 600 school districts, which is just mental. You could go to countywide school districts, which is one way to sort of disincentivize this thing about like it's my house, it's my money, my school, which is very, very powerful. The third thing I would just say, this is my last of the troika, is that the good thing is that we know we can actually fix this because there are tons of modes of learning, like individualized and otherwise, that don't rely on address at all, right? Like there are regional magnet schools that public school districts run. There are charter schools. There are independent schools that, well, it's funny, I guess homeschooling relies on your address quite a bit. But that, there's OutSchool and these other things like from the panel I did earlier. So it's like we actually know we can take this on and sort of create a world where like schooling doesn't have to be so heavily leveraged with place. And I'd just like to see more people thoughtfully applying that approach of abundance to the problem instead of an approach of scarcity, which is the one we have now.
Build on that if you would. We're getting some questions here from the audience, and I'd encourage you to continue to send your questions. I'll try to take as many as we can, but help us to kind of further that thought. So you and I were talking this morning, we often get locked into imagining what the future looks like because that's the one story that we've been told, and it takes a vivid illustration of what the future could be for us to really, imagine a better way. And so you gave some examples about how, look, we do have some learning that's not tied to where your parents live. But the question here from the audience is, are there states or even just jurisdictions within states that have really done this at scale and have made, as it says here, made positive progress on this issue where they haven't relied on sorting students based on where their parents live?
Yeah, Arizona is a great example. And in particular, I highlight Arizona because it's working really hard on transportation policy right now. I think, excuse me, most folks would agree that if you want to deleverage place, you got to deleverage distance, at the same time. It's a school choice state, but that's almost like nominal to the answer. They have just decided that all kinds of schools are going to be available in all kinds of places, which has like interesting political ramifications, like the basis and great hearts of the world, which is sort of like a classical education model, not really found in my region of the country, but certainly in the West and whatever, is very attractive to suburban parents, right? And so the fact that there is this penetration of sort of what some people would call boutique charter schools in the suburban ring has an effect on how people choose and where they're willing to go and what they find acceptable, that kind of thing. So I think Arizona is a good example. Again, from the West, Colorado, open enrollment, plus sort of like district-led programs. I think that's a really good example too. New York City, for all of its flaws, because it is incredibly flawed and remains one of the most segregated school districts in America. And like, obviously, segregation is one problem you can choose to tackle if you want to deleverage place. But because of its transportation and its density, and it's got good charter schools, it's got excellent charter schools, private schools, like good magnets that district runs or whatever, for all of its flaws, it is a place that when you work it right, you get place out of the conversation a lot more.
Mm-hmm. No, there's another question here. Why isn't this a bigger issue or a bigger conversation in school choice fights? And Chris, I want to turn to you because when I think about the traditional conversation on school choice, it has tended to be kind of an us versus them, private versus public. But if you think about school choice in this context, what we're talking about is allowing parents to choose the best education that's right for their kid in the public system. So this isn't the traditional way of thinking about school choice, but if you were to get rid of residential assignment, there are other policy considerations that flow down from that. Funding is one of them that Derrell mentioned. Maybe you could expand on that.
Yes, so we all currently live in the choice system. Some of us can actually actualize that choice system, and others cannot. Like the way that's framed is like, how many of us have decided, I want to live in this neighborhood over here versus like this neighborhood over here. Like that is a broadly defined like choice consideration, and it's often attached to like longer term thinking about the educational experience that we want our kids to have. And so when we think about the more micro framing of choice, which is what typically comes up in education conversations, that's a decision around, like, I have this school that's in my neighborhood. I actually want to send my kids to the school 20 minutes away because I think it's like a better schooling option. The really important thing in this like school choice conversation is that oftentimes we think about school choice as being this option stinks for my kid and I want to send my kid to the other option, which is like better for my kid in like a pure quality context. And that's a concerning place for us to like leave that conversation, because for every kid, because only so many kids end up like moving to the higher quality option. What I think would be an intriguing thing for us to engage with in terms of school choice is like thinking more about like the options aspect of this. Like, oh, I can choose to send my kid to this high quality early college school, or I can choose to send my kid to this high quality international baccalaureate school. Like that is a framing of choice which undergirds this instructional issue around like raising overall quality of schools, and then is more so geared towards like how am I thinking about the longer term prospects for my child. And so there's certainly like an instructional aspect of the school choice issue and this like coupling with residential assignment that sits adjacent to, and it is so really girded by how we move dollars from one school to another.
So you can't decouple the issue of school finance and school funding from quality options that are not about bad and good, but are ultimately about the option that best fits the individual student's aptitudes and what's ultimately going to be the best education for them. I think it's a really important frame shift, and one that gets us, to my mind, out of the us versus them framing around an issue like school choice, and really invites everyone in to help improve education overall, again, for all of those different stakeholders. Kelley, I want to throw one of these audience questions to you as well, because there's a question here that asked about, well, who could be against this, right? Having heard what we just heard from you all, it sounds like we ought to just get the right people in the room and change the residential assignment, and we'll all sort of focus on improving quality. But the argument that I often hear against allowing parents to make the choice of education within the public system that best fits their kids' need is, well, that might be fine for some parents, but there's a lot of parents, and by implication the majority of parents, who really just aren't to be trusted with that decision. They're really not in a position to make the best choice for the kid. We ought to leave it to the experts. So I'm going to turn to a mother and a teacher and somebody who's put everything at stake to make this choice to answer that critique.
I think it's, our children it should be our choice. Like, I have 2 daughters. I know what was best. Both of them were polar opposite. And I knew what was best for one was different than the other. So as a parent, we should have that right. And that's that's like stereotype, just saying, oh, majority of people don't. I beg to differ. When my daughter started turning 3, 4 years old, I was worried at that time. They hadn't even just starting to, socialize and get together in preschool and daycares. But I wanted to know. I was ready even at that early age in their lives. What I'm worried about the school. What school are they going to go to? I didn't know. And so I know I'm not the only parent. There's the majority that care about their children's education.
I think it's important to acknowledge that if we're going to realize the improvements, we've got to have faith in each other, right? We've got to actually believe that people are going to do the right thing. And then, of course, we've got to bring resources alongside folks to help them to do that and empower them to do that. But it starts with almost a declaration that we believe that people can do the right thing for their kids. And if we allow them to do that, we're going to see better outcomes.
Absolutely.
And then we can get everybody in a room and actually make the progress.
Yeah, it's interesting, this whole thing about like, why don't we just change it? It's not like, some people have tried to change it, right? And I would just say, sort of, because I'm looking at the screen too, some people try to change it by not changing it. So they deal with this purely as a problem of housing policy, which almost lets the schools off the hook, right? It's just like, well, you know, here's District X that has schools that are desirable. Here is more affordable housing in District X, so the problem is solved. And that fundamentally means that nobody talks about what happens with the schools at all, right? That is one way people often try to tackle this problem. It's not the way I would sort of like prefer to do it. Which is the other thing too, like, so Kelley and I did a session with a former state rep in Georgia, and she introduced a bill to decriminalize the use of somebody's address, right? Which is very provocative, as I'm sure you can imagine. Representative Valencia Stovall, who also has a great name. You can look her up. But the incentives are incredibly powerful to keep the current system as it is, right? Not the least of which, as everybody has talked about, is just the housing market is built on this entire thing. You know, as much as people can say they don't like standardized tests, like most people are looking at test scores before they pick a house, right? If you're not doing that, you're calling the person that you know that you think is like your expert who can tell you the school to get into, and you're buying, you know, or renting an apartment that is like wildly bid up, you know, for access to the school. Like someone benefits from that, right? Like maybe it's a mortgage broker or something. Like there are incentives in place that keep the system in place. And I just sort of like, again, like normally I would be looking for somebody to blame. For me, like the hardest thing about this is like knowing all of this and then being like, all right, how do we get out of this together? Like right. I think that's an important change of posture for this issue. And in the past, like it's been more like, well, you got something and you're getting too much of it. And these people don't have something and they're not getting enough of it. And the answer is for the people who have less to get what you have. And that has not been like politically winnable, you know, en masse up to now.
Well, talk about, and I'd invite anyone to contribute here, what are you seeing right now? So some of what I mentioned at the opening of the panel is the focus that parents have today on the opportunity to improve our system. And that's unique. Right? We haven't seen that level of convergence, consensus, call it, or at least momentum behind making improvements. I think a big part of that is all of us parents have watched our kids go through the last couple of years of COVID, and we've had to take a greater ownership in the outcomes of their education. But you all are in the market right now, right? Kelley, you're out there talking to different audiences. Derrell, you've got state chapters that are seeing the experimentation with different reforms. Chris, you're consulting with different jurisdictions on how to make improvements. What are you seeing that is actually creating progress, that's giving you some optimism that we can overcome these entrenched interests that are benefiting from the current system?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So I think one thing that's exciting to see unfolding in conversations around like school redesign is like changing this paradigm that is the assumption that in order for families to access a high quality school, for low-income families to access a high-quality school, they're the ones who have to move across the city. Like one of the things that's been really engaging in Massachusetts and also like in Ohio, there's various conversations going on about how to sort of like reinvent high schools, like early college being like one framing of that option that's being introduced into the sphere. And one of the things that's become like fairly explicit in a lot of those conversations is to say, the early college school should be near the families that have historically been disenfranchised. What? That's crazy. I thought good schools go in like the rich suburbs. Like, no. Like if we want to be intentional about like giving good options near people who've been disenfranchised, we should work with schools that have historically been struggling, support them in changing their model, like sort of think about what it means to give access to those schools to families who live in the community nearby, right? And think in a choice-based system or not, right? And also think about the fact that that also might be a model that attracts families who might have been opting into the private sphere or into other suburb schools to come into those school models, right? And they promote like a more diverse space than has historically been present in that community. And so you see in a lot of the conversations that district leaders are having around like early college or like other sort of high school redesign, there's a real focus on like access issues and a focus on sort of cultivating diverse spaces alongside making sure that the academic experience is good for students.
So this brings up another, call it an objection to the idea that we ought to get rid of these lines and allow parents to make choices within the public system. And you might just say, what you often hear is, well, why don't we just draw different lines, right? If we acknowledge that the history of the current lines is despicable, well, we just need different lines, right? That might be the way to ensure that folks have access to better education. If that's not right, what is the argument against that? Maybe, Derrell, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of arguments. I can't say I agree with any of them. I mean, listen, the prospect of drawing different lines, like no lines is also drawing a different line, right? And so open enrollment policy is one of the things that people have talked about. Like, obviously, transportation policy is an important underlying sort of precondition for, like, equitable open enrollment, right? But some other things, too, like, some school districts are like, we're all for open enrollment, and then when it happens, they say, we don't have any seats, like magically, right? This is so like being able to be transparent about capacity is another thing, but that is one way to sort of approach this. Like for me, the line thing is about two things, right? Lines are a mindset as much as they are a demarcation, right? And they give us a sense of ownership over things that are supposed to be owned by us all, right? So one of the things I like to talk about is like, it's like a park, right? I can go to any park in any neighborhood. I should probably do it in a day, but I can go to any park in any neighborhood, right? So if you're in New York, where I lived for 14 years, you can go to Central Park at any time of the day, and it doesn't matter where you are from, right? That's open to all. But you can't go to Gramercy because you have to live on Gramercy Park to be able to go to Gramercy Park, and you get a key to do that, right? And most people would, like some of these people who are like, oh, no, we're gonna keep the lines, just redraw. They're basically arguing that both of those parks are public because they're outside, right? And that's kind of the discussion that we're having all the time, right? Like redrawing the lines doesn't necessarily change the relationship. And I want to add sort of the bad side to this too. So I used to chair the board of this organization called EdBuild, and one of the reports we did was about, well, the staff did, because the staff was very bright, I was just the board chair, right? But one of the reports we did was about municipal secessions. So if you guys don't know what this is where you have like a taxing jurisdiction, you have like a town or whatever, you have like an edge of the town that is wealthy and has really good schools, and what it does is it just draws a line around itself. And it says, we're out, and we just take our whole thing with us. And that is a tool that is being sort of like, that is being used more and more often in red states and in blue states, across the country. And again, like the incentives reward that, right? So no lines is a good way to think about those incentives. At the same time, I just want to keep coming back to the same thing. Like the mindset is like the bard Biggie Smalls said, "What's mine is mine, what's yours is mine." As long as we have this approach, and we need to, like in my mind, we need to create our way out of it, right? And like the way we stop fighting over your school behind your line and my school over here is that I have other options that rely on neither, that are funded in an innovative way and that I get to choose. And if they're in the public system, that's fine. There's someplace else that's fine too.
Kelley, I want to ask you, because you are out there, you're sharing your story with people. What are the reactions that you're receiving when you're talking to an audience of parents or an audience of teachers or an audience of school reformers who are working on issues but might not have this one front and center? How do they respond to your story and your ideas?
Majority of the time, when people normally come up to me, they identify, they relate, they understand. because they're having that, they may have had that issue with their home situation. So it's been very receptive, everything I'm trying to do, and they understand. And, what I'm really happy about is Akron did try to do better with their schools, because the schools my daughters were in they were D, if not F, average, and that was not acceptable, and so I definitely think I've made some changes in Akron, because LeBron James decided to make a school shortly after that, and when he did, it was the I Promise school.
So we've got you to thank for I Promise.
I don't know, but
that's all right.
But it definitely showed up right after my situation.
I'll buy it. Well, it makes sense to me. I mean, how can anybody listen to your story and not decide that, well, look, if I care about education, I want to do something about this? And so what do you tell them, and not just you, Kelley, but anyone on the panel? I imagine there's some people here who maybe you already knew about this issue, but you've got more of a fire in your belly having heard from these folks. What can people do to actually help make
I just want
the
people
change?
I just want people to continue fighting for their children, for their nieces, their nephews, their grandchildren. Fight for as parents, we have rights. I didn't think I had rights. I didn't know that. What is rights? All I know is I'm taking my children to a school. I didn't know all the language and all. I just being a mom, just trying to make my way.
Right.
And I didn't know that you have rights, and get to know your rights, get involved, and make sure that you know what's going on with your children.
So we got to educate parents. We got to make sure they know what their options are. Parents are paying a lot more attention these days, right?
Yes.
Any parent that had to run either a pod or teacher to virtual education over the past couple of years, they want to know what their options are for sure. Right? What else can be done? I mean, you talked about some of the interest, Derrell. Chris, you're out there. You're working, I imagine, every week with different school districts that are trying to figure this out. What do you tell, a lawmaker or somebody who's got a position of influence in the system that they ought to be doing to improve the system right now?
Yeah. So one of the more compelling arcs in school funding, I mean, at least to me personally, over the past few decades, has been sort of elevating conversations at the state and local level around equity-based funding. And then this is a system that can be engaged with either in a context of the residential assignment or not. But what equity-based funding is meant to inspire is a conversation amongst stakeholders about what do we think students, particularly students who've historically been disserved by the system, need to thrive. What services do they need? And then through those conversations, we sort of help put together mechanisms through funding that are meant to not necessarily give every school the same thing, right? But thinking intentionally about the makeup of students in those schools, make sure that those schools are getting either more dollars or different makeup of services to sort of combat historical injustice, right? And so it's something that's happening at the state level. One of the first states to move in this direction was California, the local control funding formula, which was a intentional policy meant to elevate services for English learners as one arc of its funding mechanisms. More recently, there's been a lot of conversation in Tennessee about what needs to happen to service students across Tennessee, paying particular attention to rural populations in Tennessee, which often don't get discussed enough in conversations around assignment and options available to those students. And within state context, we're also seeing more conversation happening about how districts themselves can move away from not necessarily serving historically disenfranchised schools by just giving them the same thing as other schools, but also introducing more conversations around being very intentional with how allocations are moving to those school systems. And I think that's something that's a very engaging way to think about how do we better serve students near term, right? As we're also thinking more broadly about what does it mean to have students flowing across an entire geographic region, and sorting through some of the issues that Derrell raised around transportation and other time factors that are part of that issue.
So to a certain extent, tailoring the education to the needs of the particular students and just kind of pushing as far as you can in that direction. This brings up another question that we've got up here, kind of a combination of a couple. There's a sense by some folks that when we move to this more tailored set of options for kids, that while we might be benefiting some of the kids, we're ultimately hurting the overall system, or we're lowering the quality, say, of the public schools overall. Derrell, this has got to be something that you confront often in your role at 50 Can. What is that right? I mean, or is that a myth? And if it's a myth, as the person here who's asking the question suggests it is, how do we dispel that myth, that this gets to your zero-sum point?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I suppose this is the point where I say I reject that argument. So because it's never happened, right? Like there are, I think, like Nebraska is one of like 2 states that doesn't have any charter schools, whatever, but we've essentially moved to this system already, right? And the thing, right, that like the public schools are going to go away, whatever, it has not manifested itself, right? So it's like I suppose it is a bit of a myth that's like living in the background, but I appreciate what I assume is an earnest question from one of our audience members. I would just also say, and I think this is really important, and this is one of the things, the polling says I'm not supposed to say this, but I really have to say it because I'm really upset about it. So in 2019, 1 in 5 African-American 4th graders in the country read at or above proficient on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So that was with the system running full bore, no pandemic, no anything. 1 in 5, right? So I find it difficult to believe that we could make that worse if we tried, just to put that out there. That's real. And then the other thing is that, like, look, we spent 2 years watching the best and the worst of our public education systems writ large. And if you were in my neck, like I'm in the Northeast, so if you're in my neck of the woods, obviously there were some heroic educators, but the politics arrested the system in a way that meant millions of black kids in particular, and those are the kids I had started this work, fighting for, because I was that kid, right? They may never recover. McKinsey says that the average black 5th grader, I think, is like 6 months behind in math, that's generous, right? Like you can flip through the New York Times to see the headlines about 6th graders showing up to high school, about kids showing up to high school acting like 6th graders, right? Not to mention all the literacy crisis that's on the horizon. If there was ever going to be a time that we decided we wanted a more responsive, fair, interesting system that respected families and kids in a way that it hasn't, and that put the politics that kept the schools closed for 2 years in the rearview mirror, it is now. So like, I just want to assert that because I'm hopeful, right? And Americans are industrious people, and in a lot of respects, we saw from all kinds of families, the same families that people say aren't up to it, right? Won't make good choices. You know what they did? They got into it and they made it work, right? they were the success story of the last 2 years, and I'm like happy to support that. Like I'm proud of it. It is the best of who we are as a nation and as black people in particular, right? And I think we need to build on that momentum to transform this thing, this public commitment we have together, into something that lets every kid become the best version of themselves. And there's never been a moment in our lifetime like this moment to do that.
I think this is such an important part of the message. We focus on all of the challenges and the problems that came to people over the last couple of years, and we should, right? There's a ton to focus on there with what we've all been through COVID, but we don't say enough about the success stories. People pulled together, right? It's remarkable what parents and what teachers and what just regular folks in communities were able to do for each other and help to educate our kids. And my sense is, and we all have these stories, my sense is that so many of us sort of see our peers or our neighbors and realize that we did it. But not enough people see that that's the story that happened all across the country. And if we can help people to see that, and that's who we are as a country, I love that, it's the best that we are as a country, then all of a sudden we can start to see that some of these ideas that feel too far away, feel impossible to change, are actually a whole lot closer than we think, if we believe in people, if we believe that everybody has it within them to make good choices for their kids, for their families, and ultimately to do the right thing to move us forward as a society. I want to be respectful of the time here, but I want to offer you all the last word. We've had a good discussion. This is a really serious issue. I've seen some good optimism. But what would you like to leave this group with in terms of what can get done? Kelley, you want to start us?
Well, someone asked me, they said, I read it was directed at me, and they wanted to know if I had the opportunity, would I have changed anything? And of course I would have, because I don't want my father to have passed away 100 miles away in jail, that he didn't even know anyone. So of course I would not have done this. But the irony of it all is that I have been able to get involved so deep into advocacy and to help so many other people, and even have discussions with teachers that have actually told me, you know, what their thoughts were. And so that I was able to leverage off of what they were saying to make my environment, my school, my you know, where I work better. Because some of the teachers would say, you know, it would be unfortunate. I've had a teacher tell me that I work here because it's convenient. I don't have to do a lot. I don't have to show a lot. If I work in the suburban area that I live in, then I have to produce. And I feel like it's easier for me just to work in this inner city school because I don't have to produce, because these parents are working 2 or 3 jobs. They don't have the time for their children. Right. So I get a chance to see that and evaluate it, and of course that's not right, you know. So I don't know. I just feel like I can help so many other people on many levels now that I could not have done just sitting in a classroom.
Giving you a platform to bring this message to more people and see what's possible. I think that's great. Chris or Derrell?
Yeah, I think it's why, like, in education research strategies, like, we've had conversations with districts in this, like, rhetoric of, like, do now, build toward, and it's been, like, fascinating to think about how, like, a positive framing around the opportunities of the pandemic can really lift education leaders out of the, like, oh my gosh, like, how the heck do I get through, like, this week when I have, like, teachers out or you know, families, like, coming to me. And I really would just encourage all of us to really think through, like, how can we get to a tangible naming of what we can be doing over the course of this spring, particularly during all these conversations around how we're going to leverage ESSER 3 money. We have a lot of time left to kind of think through what it means to be intentionally investing in students as we're moving out of COVID. And I think that's a real moment of possibility for us to think about what it means for our country to look better in 24, 25 than it does now in the context of thinking about how we serve students. And I think it's really got to sit with that, particularly at a conference like, you know, South by Southwest, that's really about sort of thinking about the future. And so I just want us, like, to, you know, talked a lot about really bad things that happened in the 1900s, early 2000s, yesterday, but it doesn't have to be the case. And I just, like, really want us to, like, you know, grab onto that. You know, I hope to do that myself. So.
I think that's great. Great guidance. Derrell, take us home.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I agree that we should talk about the future, and we should think about the future, and we should think about the system that we want, and we should drive toward that based on what we now know, right? And like with any change, it's like it's easier to make when you have more information, and we have more information about what parents want and what kids want and what communities are willing to do, and like some of the good things the schools are able to do and some of the challenges they weren't able to surmount, right? So like we have all this information, like what could we do in the future? If there's one other thing I would just throw out there, it's like, you know, stories about like big systems that we all sort of live in, right? They're like collective illusions. You know, everybody like accepts that it's got to be this way, you know, are only disrupted with other stories delivered from people that you trust that are passionate about the change. And so I would just say that for everybody here, if you were moved by this discussion and you think that we should have like an education system that not just helps every kid become the best version of themselves, but that also deleverages your zip code from like, and your house from how you achieve that thing, go have that conversation with a very good friend of yours, right? And like bring them along, and then have somebody else have that conversation. And then we can pass along, we can get the system that we all deserve.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks for